Okay, hello class. Today we're going to do a ELA and Social Studies integrated lesson. So today what we're going to be talking about is the history of the voting rights in America and central message. So the two standards that we're using are H3.3, which says trace the history of voting rights in America, and RL.3.2, which says recount stories including fables, folk tales, and myths from diverse cultures, determining the central message, lesson, or moral, and explain how it is conveyed through key details in the text. So, this is a third grade lesson, which is an integrated lesson between ELA and social studies. And the ELA that we're going to focus on is central message, and the social studies that we're focusing on is the history of voting rights in America. Okay, so to begin, you guys, we're also going to be talking about the central message using this book, Lillian's Right to Vote, which is going to clarify some of the history of voting in America for us. So to begin, I want to show you guys a video that kind of explains what Americans went through to be able to gain the right to vote.
Hello, I'm Perez Hilton. Did you know that more people in the United States check their Facebook and watch the Super Bowl than exercise their right to vote? We've got some serious issues to deal with. So how come so many of us don't even bother to vote? Is it because we don't care? Or maybe it's because we don't know our history. So let's go back, way back. Our country's first election came after fighting for our independence, a fight that cost many lives, but it was worth it because instead of being ruled by a king, we were finally able to make our own laws. But not everybody was allowed to participate. You see, back then, you had to own property, be white, and a man in order to actually vote. Now, things continued that way for about 80 years, until after the Civil War, when slavery was abolished and all men were given the right to vote.
Now, hold up a minute. Just because we had the right to vote didn't mean we could use it. See, all these new voters wanted to participate, which threatened the people in power and their ability to stay in power. So they tried to stop us with violence and shady new requirements like literacy tests and poll taxes. We had to fight for nearly 100 years before the Voting Rights Act passed, which finally outlawed these dirty tricks.
And you weren't the only ones that had to fight for your right to vote. Somehow women got left out and had to organize and fight state by state, until we took our fight to Washington and finally got our right to vote all across the country. And even once the law guaranteed every person the ability to vote, you still had to be 21 in most states. So when our government began drafting people under 21 to go fight in Vietnam, they realized their lives were at stake and they had no say. Young people all across the country rose up in protest and demanded that everyone over 18 should be allowed to vote.
And since then, young people's votes have been crucial in deciding lots of big elections. Like in 2008, when a black candidate had a real chance to become president, young people showed up in record numbers.
Okay, so that video just kind of told us about some of the things that Americans had to go through before they were able to gain the right to vote for all Americans. And in this video, we heard them talk about, we were ruled by a king. And then it got to where we could make our own rules. And that's when people were allowed to vote. But it was only white men that could vote. No one else, only white men who owned property. And they tried to keep it that way for many, many years because they didn't want anyone else having any control. So doing that, they started doing these cruel things like literacy tests and poll taxes. And literacy tests were tests that they would make you pass before you could vote. And they knew that only the richer white men could pass these tests because the African Americans had been slaves and they hadn't had any schooling, and the women hadn't had any schooling because they were having to stay at home and cook and clean. So they knew that rich white men were the only ones who could pass this test, along with poll taxes, which was a tax that you would have to pay in order to be able to vote. And they knew that only rich white men could afford to pay these taxes because they were the only one who had any money. So that's how they tried to keep the voting forever and ever, just so rich white men could. And I made this timeline to show you guys how voting in America has come a long way since those white men wanted to keep it just them. This kind of shows the progression of how it was. So in 1788, we have that the Electoral College elects president. And what that is where people did not directly elect the president. Like now we can go into the voting stations and vote. Then the Electoral College elected the president, which meant that each state got 2 votes for its 2 senators. So each state would have 2 senators, and those 2 senators got to vote. And that's how that state would vote back then, through Electoral College. Then we moved to 1820 to 1830, which is when white males who own property can vote. So, you go from the Electoral College where no individuals get to vote, just the 2 senators for each state get to vote, to now rich white men can vote. And that's how, in the video we saw, they tried to keep it that way by doing the literacy test and poll taxes. They just wanted the rich white men to vote and no one else. That was in 1820 to 1830 when they gained their right to vote. Then, in 1840, we see that women began to organize to petition for suffrage. So, who can tell me what suffrage means? Okay. Good. Suffrage means the right to vote. So you see, 1820, 1830, only white males can vote, not even women, not even African Americans. So in 1840, women began to sign a petition for suffrage. They want to gain the right to vote in 1840. And then in 1850, we see where literacy laws come in, which is those literacy tests that we talked about. Those tests that you would have to pass in order to vote. And they knew that only the rich white men could pass them because they were the only educated ones. 1866, the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment allowed all men 21 and over to vote. So the 14th Amendment, just kind of said that all men 21 and over can vote. That meant even the African Americans. But we saw in the video, just because it said that doesn't mean that they still didn't do the literacy test and the poll taxes. Just because they can vote doesn't mean they can pass those literacy tests or pay the poll taxes. Then we go to 1969, which is the 15th Amendment, and this helped those men because this said all men can vote regardless of race. So this meant that African American, white, it doesn't matter, previously a slave, if you're a man and you were 21, you can vote. So this helped those, the 1920. The 19th Amendment, which said that women can vote. So now women can vote. 1964, the 24th Amendment, poll taxes are outlawed. So now there's no more poll taxes. So that meant that anyone really can vote. There's no obstacle, no poll taxes that they had to pay. And then 1965, one year later, the Voting Rights Act. And this is what really helped everyone to get to vote because it outlawed all obstacles to voting, such as literacy tests and poll taxes. So now no one had to pass a test. No one had to be able to pay this tax. All women can vote. All men can vote regardless of race or if they were previously a slave. None of that matters now. You can all vote. And then in 1971, we see the voting age is changed from 18 to 20, is 18 instead of 21. Previously, the voting age was 21. But at this time in 1971, the Vietnam War was going on, and they were drafting young men who were the age of 18, and these men were going off to war, but they weren't even allowed to vote yet. So they started petitioning, if we're old enough to go to war, we should be able to be old enough to vote. So in 1971, the age changed from 21 to 18. So now all 18-year-olds, no matter your gender or race, If you are a citizen of the United States of America, you can vote. And so that's just how far voting has come in America. You see all these things that Americans have had to go through in order to be able to vote. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of talk about that. We're going to talk about how far it came. So who can tell me some examples of how voting has changed since over the time? Who can tell me what's changed about voting? Okay, good. Some examples are now we can vote as individuals. There's no electoral college. We individually can vote. Also, it doesn't just have to be a rich white man. It can be an African American man. It can be a woman. It doesn't matter your race. It doesn't matter if you were previously a slave. You can vote regardless of gender or race. Also, you don't have to be 21. You can be 18 and vote. So these are just some examples of how far voting in America has come. Okay? So how many of you have ever been to vote with your parents? Maybe gone with them to the voting station to vote? Okay, good. So I want you to raise your hand if you think you're going to vote whenever you get older. Okay, good. So this book that we're going to read tells us why it's so important to practice our right to vote. And to practice your right means to do it. Like, for example, we have the right to vote now, and we're very blessed to have it, because before we couldn't, I could have never voted before because I was a woman. I wasn't a rich white man. But now I have the right to vote. And I'm also, you had to be 21. So, now I have that right. I can vote. So it's important for me to practice my right. And we're going to read this book that's going to tell us about why it's so important to practice our right to vote. And this book is Lillian's Right to Vote. But before we read this book, there's some vocabulary words that I want to discuss. So since we're talking about central message today, I want to talk with you guys about what central message means. So here I have the definition of central message. Central message, the big idea that the story is about. So while I'm reading this book, we're going to think about the central message. We're going to think about the big idea that this whole story is about, okay? Because that's really important for us to understand what we're looking for. We're looking for why it's so important for us to practice our right to vote, and the history of voting. We're thinking about the history of voting. What all happened for us to be able to vote? Why is it so important for us to vote now? And this book is going to tell us that if we focus on the central message of the book, which is the big idea that the story is about. So that's what we're going to be thinking about while I'm reading you guys this book, is central message, okay? And then also, before we start reading the book, there's some vocabulary words I think we need to talk about. And one of them is suffrage. And as you guys can see here on my little PowerPoint, suffrage means the right to vote. So the word suffrage means the right to vote. We saw that on our timeline where in 1840, when the women to begin to organize petition for suffrage, they were trying to organize a petition to gain the right to vote, which is suffrage. Okay? And then voting, which is what we're talking about today, the history of voting in America. Voting means a formal expression of opinion or choice, either positive or negative, made by an individual or body of individuals. So the voting that we're talking about is voting for our President of the United States and how the history of it has changed in America. So we're talking about an individual expressing their opinion or choice. So we know that whenever we're voting, that means we're going to go and we're going to express our opinion. We're going to select the candidate that we personally, in our own opinion, think will be the best option for the job. Okay? All right, so remember to think about these words, voting and suffrage, and remember to think about central message, the big picture that the story is about. Think about that while I'm reading this story. Okay? All right. Lillian's Right to Vote. A very old woman stands at the bottom of a very steep hill. It is voting day, and she's an American, and she is going to vote. Lillian is her name. Here's Lillian, and she's going to vote on voting day in America. It's a long haul up that steep hill. It's a long haul when you've been alive for 100 years. It's a long haul when you've lived the life that Lillian has and walked so far in her shoes. When Lillian looks up, it's more than a blue sky she sees. She sees history. Lillian sees her great-great-grandparents, Elijah and Sarah. They are standing side by side on an auction block. Sarah is holding their baby Edmund, and they are being sold as slaves in front of the very same Alabama courthouse where rich white men and no one else are allowed to vote. So here's Lillian, and she's going up this steep hill on her way to vote. And as she's walking on her way to vote, she's thinking about the history. All of this that we've been discussing, the history of voting in America and how far it has come, she's thinking about this on her walk. She's thinking about how the history of voting affected her personally. It affected her great-grandparents. You know, she says that Elijah and Sarah were standing side by side on an auction block. They were being auctioned off as slaves in front of the courthouse where only those rich white men could vote and no one else. So that's what she's thinking about on her walk to go vote. Lillian starts her slow climb. Though the sun shines brightly, Lillian sees a dark time from long years past. She sees her great-grandpa Edmund, now grown. He is owned by another man, forced to pick cotton from daybreak to nightfall, right here in this country where it is written that all men are created equal. He sure doesn't have the right to vote. In fact, he doesn't have the right to do much at all until after the Civil War, which is when slavery will end. So she's still climbing up that hill, and she's thinking about that dark, dark past that her great-grandfather went through. You know, he was a slave. He was owned by another man. He did not have the right to vote. He was not treated equally as those rich white men. She's thinking about that. She's going to practice her right. As Lillian inches up the hill, past one neighbor's house and then the next, she sees her great-grandpa Edmund on his way to vote for the first time. Thanks to a law that was passed in 1870. That law is the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which says that American citizens' right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Even though the law does not allow women to vote, Great-Grandma Ida is with her husband. Lillian feels their dignity and their pride as they enter that courthouse for the first time. So now Grandpa Edmund, who we saw right here, he was picking cotton. He was a slave owned by another man. He didn't have the right to vote. You know, he was just a slave until the Civil War. Slavery ended, and then they passed that 15th Amendment we read about on our timeline, which said that the 15th Amendment said that any man can vote regardless of their race. So now Grandpa Edmund is on his way to vote. Okay? But as Lillian continues, the hill gets steeper. My, but that hill is steep. She sees what happens just 20 years later, right here in Alabama. There's her grandpa Isaac at the courthouse being charged a poll tax to vote. A tax he doesn't have the money to pay. So much for that 15th Amendment. So much for Grandpa Isaac's right to vote. So the 15th Amendment was passed saying that you could vote regardless of race. And then those rich white men who had the power still didn't want any African Americans or women to be able to vote. So they started charging those poll taxes we talked about, knowing that they couldn't pay those poll taxes. Lillian pauses to catch her breath, hearing now the voice of her Uncle Levi. He is telling about those tests he was forced to take when he tried to vote, about the registrar's sneer on his face when he asked how many bubbles are in a bar of soap. Her uncle's lips go tight as he recalls being asked to name all 67 judges in the state of Alabama and being turned away when he failed to answer such questions. And there she's talking about those literacy tests. They knew they couldn't pass those tests, so they would ask them these crazy questions knowing that they didn't know the answer. And then they couldn't vote because they didn't pass these tests. Lillian's thinking about all this as she's climbing up that steep hill to go get to vote. And that steep hill is a symbolism for all the struggles that Americans went through in the history in order to be able to vote. As Lillian pushes on, struggling to keep her balance, she sees a brave girl standing next to her mother and a father as they try to register to vote. The year is 1920 and the 19th Amendment had just passed, a law allowing women to vote. The girl is Lillian herself with her mama and papa. They are being chased away by an angry mob. There's Mr. Bentley, the barber, and Mr. McCoy, who owns the ice cream shop. She feels a firm grip on her mother's hand as they run through the streets back home. See, now it's 1920. The 19th Amendment we talked about has gotten passed. Women can vote. So they're trying to practice their right, and they're getting just attacked by this angry mob. She's thinking about this as she's climbing her hill to go vote, about all the struggles that Americans went through. And though today the birds are singing and people are smiling, Lillian sees a vivid orange and brilliant red, the cross burning on the lawn of her girlhood home, set aflame by the same angry mob just because her parents want to vote. This is something she will always see. And that's just talking about how people didn't want the African Americans to vote, so sometimes they would go start fires, just because they didn't want them to vote. And so it was just a lot of ugliness going on at this time. Lillian stops in her tracks, unable to keep going. As she stands there, she sees herself trying to register to vote for the first time. She sees a blank piece of paper which she must write down a section of the U.S. Constitution word for word, as it is being mumbled by the registrar, a test she could not pass. No one could. So here's Lillian. She's going to vote. Now she's a woman and she can go vote. The 19th Amendment has been passed. And Lillian goes to vote, and they do another one of these tests on her, and Lillian can't do it. She can't vote. That's what she's thinking about. She's climbing that hill to go vote. Are you going to vote? She asks a young man who passes her on her route. She's on her way to go vote, and she passes a young man. She asks if he's going to vote. He says, "Yes, ma'am." "You better," she says, and she means it. For Lillian sees a funeral procession for a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old shot by a policeman over nothing more than taking part in a peaceful protest. In March 1965, all he wanted was justice and the right to vote. Looking at the top of the hill, Lillian wonders how she'll ever make it. It looks so far and she's so tired. Though her feet and legs ache with 100 years of walking, what fuels her ancient body is seeing those 600 people beginning a peaceful protest march from Selma to Montgomery. People who, though they don't know it yet, will be stopped on a bridge in Selma by policemen with clubs. All they want is justice and the right to vote. At the front is future Congressman John Lewis, whose forehead will always bear the scar from where he was beaten. So Lillian's on her way. She's almost up the hill, but she's tired, and she starts thinking, how will she ever make it? But then she starts thinking about this history that Americans faced, all this cruelness that happened in the world that was going on while Americans were trying to vote. People didn't want them to vote. So all these angry mobs and all these protests were going on. It was just such a dark time. And people went through some terrible things. And Lillian's thinking about that, and that's her motivation to get up the hill. As long as Lillian still has a pulse, she is going to vote. And so she keeps on climbing, keeps on seeing this time the second march from Selma, the march that also ends on the bridge in a prayer led by Reverend Martin Luther King, whose dreams of justice for African Americans are already famous. Wherever he went, he lifted people up with his words, and his words still lift up Lillian, who, seeing the top of the hill, is not about to stop. Footstep by footstep, she keeps going on. She keeps pushing on, thinking about all these people, about Martin Luther King, who stood up for what he believed in for the rights for African Americans. She keeps thinking about all this, and that's what's pushing her. Just as the marchers from Selma to Montgomery keep on going through the cold and rain, finally making it all the way to Montgomery on their third march, she sees them all, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, rabbis, priests, and 25,000 others. Lillian is there. She can still hear Reverend King asking how long they'd have to wait for justice. She can still feel the power of his voice when he says, "Not long." And she takes those final steps to the top of the hill. Lillian can still see how Reverend King was right, for she can hear the voice of President Lyndon Johnson on her TV saying, "There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. All of us must overcome the crippling legacy of injustice, and we shall overcome." Before Lillian walks through the doors of the building, where you better believe she will vote, she looks up and sees the same blue sky, brighter than any sky she's ever seen. that she saw on August 6, 1965. That was the day President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, the one law protecting all Americans' right to vote in every state and every town, the one law protecting Lillian as a full-fledged citizen of the United States. So that's talking about that Voting Rights Act that we talked about in 1965 on our timeline. It outlawed all those poll taxes and literacy tests. It allowed anyone to be able to vote, as long as they were a citizen of the United States. She enters the building, and as Lillian steps into the voting booth, once again she sees herself stepping into the voting booth in 1965 for the very first time. And she knows full well she would not be standing here today if it were not for those people who marched and the people who died for her right to vote. Lillian touches her finger to the lever, and because she is a citizen of the United States of America protected by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Lillian pushes that lever, and Lillian votes. The end. So, in this book, this book is talking about Lillian's travel to go vote up that steep hill. You know, she's struggling to get up that hill because she's 100 years old, and that's a long, hard walk for her to go up that big hill. But as she's doing it, she's thinking about all those people that died or went through those terrible things in order for us to be able to vote, in order for Lillian to be able to vote that day. So she's bound and determined she's going to get up that hill and she's going to vote. And the book talks about how because of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, she can vote. And because of, all those things that we talked about in our timeline, they were pretty much all mentioned in this book. And they're all reasons that we're able to vote today. And that's kind of sad because when you think about the history of voting in America, you think about what all those people went through. Being turned down, their yards being burned, like this book mentioned, being chased by angry mobs, all the petitions, all that terrible stuff that happened to people, just so that we could have the right to vote today. And we do have the right to vote because of all this that went on. So that's kind of what we need to think about when we think about this book. So now I want us to think about the central message of this book. And can anyone tell me in words what the central message of this book, or what you think the central message of this book is? Good. So the central message of the book is that we need to practice our rights to vote, because all of that went on in the history of voting in America, all that people went through just for us to be able to vote, it's very important for us to practice that vote. It talks about the history and all those terrible things that went on. So, I want you guys to think about the book that we just read, and I want you to compare it to the video that we watched at the beginning. You guys remember in the video, it talked about how African Americans still couldn't vote because they had those literacy tests and those poll taxes, you remember? And in the book, Lillian talks about that. She talks about her uncle who couldn't pass the literacy test, so he wasn't able to vote. And then Lillian went to take it, and there was still a literacy test, and she couldn't pass it to vote. Okay, so now what I want you guys to do is to get out your iPads and go to the Chatterpix app. Let's see that. Okay. And I have taken a picture of Lillian on each of your Chatterpix app. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend like we're Lillian, okay? And on our Chatterpix app, we're going to use the picture of Lillian that I've put on all of your iPads. We're going to use that picture to tell the central message of our book, okay? So I have an example. I made one for an example, okay? And I want to show you guys that one. And then I want you guys to each make your own central message Chatterpix, okay? So we're going to pretend like we're Lillian in the Chatterpix, okay? And so you're going to be Lillian, and you're going to tell the central message of your book from Lillian's point of view, okay? So here is my example. Hold on one second. What we're going to do is if mine doesn't end up working, I'll just kind of tell you guys what I said. But you take a picture of Lillian and you record yourself saying, "Hi, I'm Lillian." And the central message of this book was to explain to you guys the history that my family went through, all the terrible things that my family went through in order to be able to vote. This included the poll taxes, the literacy tests, the angry mobs, the burning of my yard, all of these terrible things that my family went through in the past just for me to be able to vote. And that is why it is so important for me to be able to vote now, because we don't have any of that now, all because of what they did in the past for us. So just a little something like that, in your chatter pics, just to kind of show me that you guys know what central message is. Hi there, I'm Lillian, and the central message of my story is that for me to be able to vote, my family and I went through a long, hard history of gaining this right. This included being left out, tortured, and many other things just to be able to vote, which is why I see it is so important to be able to practice your rights and go and vote while you have the chance to. Okay, so I want each of you to make a ChatterPix using the Lillian picture that's on your ChatterPix app, and I want you to do this, and I want you to be Lillian and discuss the central message from this book. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to do that. And then we're going to move on to the next thing. And if you guys have any questions about your ChatterPix app or anything like that, you can ask me. And I'll be walking around to make sure that you guys understand central message. Okay, so now what we're going to do for our independent practice is each of you are going to get one of these graphic organizers. The directions say, draw pictures and write about how far voting in America has come based off of the history of voting that we learned about today. So what I want you guys to do is each of you are going to get a graphic organizer, and I want you to use your new central message skills. You guys now know what central message is, right? Who can tell me what central message is? Right, it is the big picture that the story is trying to tell. And we just use those skills to be Lillian in our ChatterPix app and tell what the central message of Lillian's right to vote is. We told what the central message of that is using ChatterPix from Lillian's point of view, right? So I want you guys to use your new central message skills and think about the central message of the lesson today. We talked about the history of voting in America, and we talked about how far voting in America has come. We talked about why it's so important to practice our rights as Americans to vote because of all the history that those people went through and all the bad things and how far America has come. I want you guys to use your knowledge of all that, all your new central message skills to draw pictures of how far voting in America has come. Think about the video. Think about the timeline. Think about our book. Think about all that, okay? And just draw us a picture. You can draw some examples, maybe some literacy tests or some polls, whatever you want to draw, just to kind of show us examples of how far it's come. Then down here, I want you to write a few sentences about it. Write about how far voting in America has come since 1788, when we couldn't even vote as individuals, when there was an electoral college who did that. Write about how far it's come since then. Like I said, you can use the timeline, the video, the book. You can refer back to any of that to talk about how far it has come. So I want you guys to draw a picture and write about it. And then when you're finished with your graphic organizer, after you've drawn and written about it, I want you to turn to your partner and I want you to read and explain your drawing. Read your writing to them and explain your drawing to them. And discuss with them your graphic organizer and how you think history has changed and how the voting in America has developed over time, okay? And to anyone who needs to come up to me and tell me about this, you can come up to my desk, and when you are finished, place these in the basket. Okay? I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to work on those. And read them to your partners or come and tell me if you need to. Okay. So is everyone done with their graphic organizers? Has everyone read and told me everything they need to? Okay. So now I'm going to just show you guys some pictures of what it's like to go in and vote. And when you go in and vote, you walk into this station, wherever the nearest voting station is near you. But before you can vote, you do have to register to vote. Okay? You have to register to vote and able to vote. And anyone can register to vote as long as you're an American citizen, 18 or older, because those are the rules. You have to be 18, you have to be a citizen. You register to vote, and then on voting day, you walk into your voting station. You show them a form of ID, which can be like a license. Anyways, they take that, they check to make sure you are who you say you are, and they check to make sure that you're registered to vote. Then they give you this little card. You take the card and you go to a voting station, which looks like this. They have these voting stations that are set up where no one can see what you're voting for. So either you're in your own little cubicle with a curtain. You go to your little curtain. You go in there, you insert the card that they gave you, and then you're going to vote for. You remember the definition of voting was, let me read that definition of voting to you guys. Again. A formal expression of opinion or choice, either positive or negative, made by an individual or body of individuals. So this is made by an individual because we can now individually vote. We don't have the Electoral College anymore. You're individually going in there to express your opinion or choice of who you think the best candidate is. So you go in these little cubicles to do that, and it's, no one can see because you have these curtains, and you select who you, in your opinion, think is the best choice. And here's another picture. This is an example of the little computers that you do it on. This is what you insert the chip in, and it's on a computer, and then it'll ask you some questions about which one you want to pick and stuff, and you'll just pick them, and that's how voting is done. So I encourage you guys to go do this when you get old enough to, because remember in our book it talks about the history of voting and how far the history of voting in America has come and why it's so important for us to practice those rights. That's the central message of our book, and we can learn so much from the central message of this book. We learned so much about the history of voting in America and how far it has come, which is why we know we need to practice these voting rights.